Hey there, church family. This was week 6 of the E100 series, and we looked at the period of the Judges. Last week, Joshua ends by stressing not one of the Lord's faithful promises to the family of Israel was left unfulfilled. The promise to Abraham were offspring and land. We've talked about that. Well, here we are. Israel's a nation, and they're in the land. The remaining promise is that Israel would bring blessing to the world. To do that, God has made a covenant with Israel, giving them his law, along with blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. And the question is, will they be faithful to him? No. In fact, Judges is a very dark chapter in the history of Israel. Judges 2 contains a sort of summary of what goes on in the book. There's a cycle. Israel forgets God and ignores his covenant. God hands Israel over to their enemies. The people turn to the Lord and cry out for mercy. God sends a judge, a heroic figure, who saves Israel from their enemies. And there's a period of rest. But this does not last, and Israel, once again, forgets the Lord and acts just as wickedly as before, and the cycle continues. A few things stand out in the book. First, victory over their enemies only comes by God's power. In the battle that Barak fights, the text simply says, Yahweh routed Israel and all his chariots. When Gideon fights the Midianites, God whittles down the army to only 300 men, and the battle plan seems similar to that of the battle at Jericho. The army just stands there and makes some noise, and the camp of Midian implodes. Beyond that, every time Samson uses his strength, the text makes clear it was the Spirit of Yahweh rushing upon him that enabled him to do miraculous feats. What should Israel have learned? Yahweh saves Israel from her enemies. Without him, they can do nothing. But Israel does not listen. Rather, the book says 16 times either that Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, or that everyone did what was right in their own eyes, which amounts to the same thing. Israel continues to follow after the ways of the nations, so God hands them over to be ruled by the nations. Even the judges are themselves severely flawed. Yeah, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar seem fine, but as time goes on, it gets worse. Gideon, for example, is a coward and an idolater, and Samson's life actually mirrors that of his people. Samson, like Israel, had a supernatural origin. Both were devoted to the Lord for a special calling. Both have God fight for them. Both Samson and Israel break their vows to the Lord. And the Lord abandons Samson, and he's taken into captivity, just like his people. But at least there's hope for Israel as Samson ends his life victorious when God's Spirit returns to him. Now, these men are severely flawed. Yes, when they acted by faith, and Hebrews 11 rightly praises them for that. But their flaws show they are not the Savior Israel needs. The spiral of sin accelerates downward to a very dark place. We didn't read Judges 19, but it's quite disturbing. The story of Judges 19 is beat for beat almost identical to Genesis 19. A city in Israel has become like Sodom and Gomorrah. And the book ends with the tribe of Benjamin nearly wiped out in a holy war that is just like we saw in the book of Joshua. If God doesn't change something, Israel will not survive. The last story in the book begins and ends by crediting all this evil to the fact that Israel had no king. Without godly leadership, the people have descended into anarchy. We need a king who will rule us according to God's way. Now, this sets us up for the theme of next week's reading, which will focus on kingship. This week we also touched on the book of Ruth, which happens during the days of the Judges. When Elimelech and his sons die in Moab, Ruth, a widow Gentile, decides to follow her mother-in-law and unite herself to the people and God of Naomi. Leaving her father's house to a land she doesn't know, Ruth's story is like Abraham's. And she is part of the promise to Abraham that in him all the nations will be blessed. Remember the two big promises to Abraham, offspring and land? Well, suddenly we zoom in and begin to care very deeply about a very small subset of that promise. What will happen to Elimelech's land now that he has no heir? What will happen to the family line of Elimelech because his sons are dead? While the very existence of Israel as a nation is threatened by their own sin, God is working a plan to save the nation through a very specific family. Boaz, a faithful descendant of Judah, redeems the land of Elimelech and also continues his family line by marrying Ruth, going above and beyond what was required in God's law. And it isn't till the very last words of the book that we find out why God orchestrated all of this. Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, Jesse fathered David, the godly leader whom the book of Judges pleads for, the king who will lead the people back to the Lord, will be found in David and in his offspring. But we'll meet him next week. What did this week teach us about sin? How did it help us understand God's work of salvation? Let us know in the comments, and see you next week.